So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to look at what for many of us will be a familiar story, but see if there might be anything new that God has to tease out of it for us and kind of what it looks like for us as modern day apprentices. This story comes out of Mark 10. It is Jesus' healing of the blind man Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. And it comes at an interesting kind of transitional point within the gospel. The current chapter has had a bunch of stories, but they're all kind of have this core of they have to do with discipleship. They all have to do with the correct way of following Jesus. And this story ends up being kind of a cap of those stories, but it's also kind of a transition, and that from this point on, it's going to be Jesus and the triumphal entry going into Jerusalem, and then it's going to be kind of Jesus versus everyone. The rest of the book. So it's transitioning from these discussions of discipleship into what eventually is going to be Jesus' crucifixion, the horrible way in which God redeems the world. So let's look at this story before we do anything else. Okay, so in Mark chapter 10, we read, "And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying, 'Take heart, get up, and he's calling you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." So this story follows what scholars are going to call a miracle story. There's kind of a set way that miracle stories are usually told in the Gospels, and particularly in the Gospel of Mark. And so when a story deviates from kind of that typical way of telling it, it often is telling us what the author is wanting to kind of emphasize in this one. And so this one is tweaked more than many. And then I would argue, based on where it is in context, the fact that we've been talking about discipleship, Mark has kind of altered this telling of the story to point out some important things, not just about God's goodness and kindness to someone who is in need, not just about faith, although those elements are definitely still in the story, but about what it might mean, God's goodness, God's strength and power, our need for faith in the story of discipleship itself. So some of the just kind of interesting tweaks to this story is, one is that question, right? What do you want me to do for you? I don't think I'd ever caught before this week that is the words from Jesus' mouth, word for word, come from the story right before it. The story right before this one is when James and John, two of his disciples, come to him and said, "Hey, we'd like to ask a favor." And Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they say, "We want you to set us at your right and your left," right? When you come in glory, when everything's good, we want to be, number 2 and number 3, or however that works. And Jesus rebukes them and says, that's not the way we need to be thinking about discipleship in the kingdom. It's not what it's like to follow me. And yet here again, we have that exact same question, and where the disciples, those who were supposed to get it, had kind of failed. They had looked for kind of personal glory. They'd thought of this kind of triumphalist version that everything is going to be okay. Here we have a simple blind man who is able to articulate very well what it is he needs from God, right? Like, I'm blind and I want to see. And when Jesus asks him that question, what do you need? And he says, I would like to see. He doesn't take it in the same directions the actual disciples did. He takes it in the direction of restoration, of wholeness, which is definitely a lot more about what Jesus was about than about kingdoms and glory and power, right? The blindness aspect is also interesting in that Mark likes to tell these stories about blindness and restoration around conversations of discipleship. He doesn't emphasize it as much as John does. John's gospel really loves playing with this idea of blindness and insight, right? He even has this argument with religious leaders that they're, he's saying, "Oh, are we blind then? Are we?" And Jesus is like, "Yeah, pretty much." But Mark emphasizes the same thing. Again, here's this man who recognizes that he is blind in a way the disciples don't seem to be, right? He's literally blind, and yet his spiritual insight is better than those who are insiders, who have been trained and they're supposed to get it. And yet, at the end of their story of asking what they want from God, they appear to remain blind as to spiritual insight wise, whereas Bartimaeus does not. He gets it, as the story is going to keep kind of showing us. And just to make sure we get this point, Mark picks some very specific language. He doesn't say he followed him to Jerusalem. He doesn't say he followed him up the road. He says, and he followed him. Let me just see it, because they use this translation almost always. And he followed him on the way. Now, this language is a little bit missed on us because we have a different name for the movement that we are part of, that Jesus started, right? We, in the modern world, who are following Jesus are usually called Christians, Christians, which makes sense. We are those who, are associated with Christ. But before that name, which was originally derogatory, by the way, was applied to people who followed Jesus, they called themselves the followers of the way, or simply the way. What is it you guys do? We're followers of the way. We're the way. It's a way of being in the world, right? And so Mark, using this language for Bartimaeus, is not simply saying he walked along the road with him, but he is kind of symbolically following along Jesus in a way that the actual disciples don't seem to be capable of right then. And so if Mark is using this miracle story to make a specific argument about Bartimaeus as the ideal disciple, I read a lot this week. Okay, if this man is himself a symbol, what can we learn from him? And so there's a couple of different things that I think we can look at Bartimaeus and see why he gets it right. So first thing is, as he hears who he is, he hears it's Jesus of Nazareth. And he begins to cry out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," right? So he picks a messianic title right away. That would have been probably in the air, as Jesus is heading for the triumphal entry, as Jesus is coming in glory. So people would have been thinking about that, but he could have gone different directions. Even later on, he's going to call him rabbi, recognizing he's a teacher, or a prophet, or simply, another religious leader in some way, shape, or form. And yet he picks up on Messiah. He picks up on Son of David, and yet he's not thinking in the same terms that the other disciples are when they use this language, right? They're thinking power and glory and victory. He is thinking of, a lot of people think that Mark might have had the passage in Jeremiah, where is it? Jeremiah 31, verses 7 through 9, in which it talks about God gathering the nations, gathering people from all over, gathering especially the lame and the blind. That God's version of Messiah is not all about lifting up Israel and making them powerful like it was back in the day when David was king. Bartimaeus seems to have this dream of Messiah, which is in the Old Testament, though largely ignored, of God gathering the entire family of humanity again under his wings, of restoring and healing even those who are unimpressive and might not be gathered into most kingdoms. And so Bartimaeus' view of who Jesus is as a disciple, of who Jesus is as the Messiah, is very different than that of the actual disciples. He sees him as the king. I really like, and I think this is a big aspect of what it means to be a disciple, is he's just kind of rude. And what I mean by that is there are obstacles in the way, right? People, they see Jesus marching by. They want to get to the main event, the triumphal entry. The disciples are probably hot and tired and sick. And yet Jesus allows himself to be distracted because Bartimaeus is not going to miss this opportunity. He knows he has needs. He knows that there are obstacles, right? He's blind. He can't get to him on his own. He really is going to have to make a ruckus if he is hoping to get Jesus' attention in this crowd in which Jesus probably has all kinds of things on his mind. And he has no intention of not getting what he needs from God at this point. He knows what his need is, and he's going to overcome obstacles, and that is needed for disciples at times. Sometimes we even got to step on social conventions. We got to be obnoxious when people are telling us we don't need something. And I really appreciated in some of my reading this week just how it was pointed out that this is often the need or the thing that is said to people who are the most vulnerable, the most beat up, whether it's because of unfair racial systems or economic systems, or if people who are looked past, I don't know, ableism. There's a million of them, right? There's a lot of people who are simply told to shut up and stop talking, stop whining. And I loved one of the comments of this is an inspiring figure who will not let things continue to be the way they are. He knows he needs healing and he needs wholeness. And he is not going to let other people, even if he has to step on a few toes, stand in the way of what God desires for him. So I liked that. I liked that as an aspect of discipleship. A lot of people have made a lot out of the fact that he steps out of his cloak, right? So a cloak would have been a major marker of his identity as a beggar. It's where he would have kept any money he made. And we don't hear anything about him scrambling to put his things in his pockets, of sweeping up his cloak. And again, it could be just he's excited. He knows he's gotten what he wants. He's going to go meet Jesus. But a lot of people have made a lot out of the fact that he is, by leaving his cloak and potentially his earnings on the side of the road, he's leaving behind a piece of his identity. He trusts so much that he is going to receive his eyesight. He's no longer going to be, defined by this disability. He's not the blind man anymore. I don't know what that means for him going forward, and who knows, maybe he walked back and picked it up afterwards. But just the recognition from this kind of symbolic reading that we might be required to leave something behind. Maybe it's an old wound. Maybe it's an identity based around some kind of, way we've been unfairly treated, in ways which we are victim, or something that was done to us that is wrong. I don't know. But I think discipleship is always going to have a willingness to leave behind some things so that we can receive something better. And at times, we're not willing to leave behind things that we're used to or feel safe or a part of our identity. Those might have to go with discipleship as well. Again, I've made several allusions to this, but I just want to point out that I love that Jesus asks him. It's pretty obvious what his need is, right? He's a blind guy. He's begging. He's in need of some help. And yet Jesus offers him something that that not many people are willing to offer to those in need. And he offers him agency, right? He asks him rather than tells him. Here's what I see is wrong. Jesus is considerably more insightful than we are ever in these things. And yet how often when we're helping people do we show up assuming we know what is needed? And yet he simply asks, what do you want me to do for you? And gets a very different answer than when he said this for the disciples, right? He offers him his own agency. He allows him to also articulate what his need is. And again, in this story, it could be pretty obvious. Lord, I want my sight back, but that's not the only thing. He could have said, Lord, I want a house. I want to be rich and have servants take care of me because, I'm blind and I can't do things for myself. He could have said a lot of different things, but he knew very specifically what his need was. Again, reading that symbolically, do we know what is wrong? Do we know where we need God's touch? Or are we just kind of vague about it? Yeah, God, make it all work out. God, do good things, and we're not willing to look at those places of blindness within ourselves because it may cost us. Again, we might have to leave some things behind if God is to touch those things. Do we know what we want from God? He trusts that Jesus can do something about it, right? How often are we so used to the things in the world and we imply cynicism to protect ourselves? We don't want to ask things from God, or trust that God can make it better, except maybe in the sweet by and by or whatever, right? Because we're afraid of being disappointed. We're afraid of trusting that God desires our wholeness, because what if we don't get it? What if we get our hopes up and we lose out? There is none of that in Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus has nothing to lose. He says, Lord, I want to see. And he does. And Jesus says, your faith has made you well. You trusted me, that I wanted to, that I could, that you could be whole again. How much of our spirituality does not extend to Jesus, that same level of trust and kind of his attitude of good-heartedness? I don't know, something that's kind of fearful for us to admit to ourselves. And finally, of course, after he gets what he wants from God, he does not go back to his other identity. He follows him along the way. He joins this journey, which is going to end at the cross pretty soon, though he and no one else really gets that yet. So Bartimaeus, the man, probably was aware of some of these things, but Mark points us to him in a lot of ways. I think there is a lot there for things we can learn from this man and his need, and often our own spiritual need. I don't usually do this, but I thought the scholar N.T. Wright had a very interesting approach to this, and he invites us into kind of an imagination experiment or something. So I wanted to read some of kind of his reflection questions as I end this talk. He says, this is the kind of story that lends itself particularly well to slow, patient meditation. Take some time and imagine yourself in the crowd that day in Jericho. It's hot, dry, dusty. It almost always is there. You're excited. You're with Jesus. You're going up to Jerusalem. And here is someone shouting from the roadside. It's a nuisance. It's possibly even dangerous. If enough people call him Son of David, someone in authority is going to get alarmed. Examine your feelings. Try to remember other times when you felt like that. And then watch as Jesus, never put out by what annoys his followers, remember the children earlier in the chapter, turns to speak to the blind man. How do you feel about that? Do you want this beggar in the party? How about when Jesus speaks warm and welcoming words to him? Has he ever spoken to you like that? How do you feel as you set off together up the hill to Jerusalem? Now imagine yourself as the blind man. We all have something, by no means necessarily a physical ailment, that we know is getting in the way of our being the people we believe God wants us to be and made us to be. Sit by the roadside and listen to the crowd. Examine your own feelings when you discover it's Jesus coming by. Call out to him, and when he summons you, put everything aside and go to him. And when he asks what you want him to do for you, go for it. Don't look back at the small, selfish comforts of victimhood. Ask for freedom, for salvation, and when you get it, be prepared to follow Jesus wherever he goes next. I think it's an exercise worth something to put ourselves in the shoes of those different things. So let me ask just these final reflection questions from this story. Are we willing to learn about God from outsiders, from dirty, blind beggars and the like, right? The disciples still needed to learn a lot about God. Bartimaeus is probably not the ideal teacher, and yet he has things to teach us all about who God is and who Jesus is and what he values and wants from us. Do we know where we need God's touch? Kind of reflecting that same question N.T. Wright was asking. Do we know the places in which we need God's healing touch? Do we trust that God desires to heal and to help? And what has to be left behind if we are to follow?